Hello, and welcome back to the School of Whispers podcast. We are back for 2025 and hitting strong with an interview with astrologer, acupuncturist, and farmer Dr. Steve Moreau. Dr. Steve would describe himself as a metaphysician, and he has been in practice for several decades now, and he does a beautiful job of combining the metaphysical with the medical. On this episode, though, we are going full metaphysical and diving into astrology. So, Dr. Steve has a background in Vedic as well as Western astrology, and we sort of combine the two, but really focus on the planets within the astrological system. And we really focus on Saturn return, which is something I am myself in. You may be coming up to it, you may be in the thick of it, or you may be on the other side. But regardless of where you stand on your side of the Saturn return, this conversation will help you make sense of what the fuck happened during that time, or will happen, or is happening during that time in your life. So if you're not quite sure what a Saturn return is, stay with me. We're going to get into it soon. But to give you a couple of highlights from this episode, how illness, which Dr. Steve would describe as liver qi stagnation and getting into TCM diagnosis, brought him to Chinese medicine, which eventually brought him to Sri Lanka, where he found astrology, the main differences between Vedic and Western astrology, the different characters and consciousnesses of the planets within astrology, what the heck a Saturn return is and how to best navigate through it, and the wild astrological forecast for the United States for the next 5 or so years. This part is at the very end of the conversation, and I'm telling you, it is so worth waiting for. Every time I re-listen, it blows my mind a little bit because it makes so much sense, and it also has given me a lot of peace as I look at the chaos that's to come. As Dr. Steve likes to say, it's a marathon, not a sprint, and we ain't seen nothing yet. So buckle in, friends. This is a great podcast full of so much wisdom, so much information, and I hope you enjoy. If you would like to connect with Dr. Steve, you can find all of his information in the show notes. Welcome to the School of Whispers podcast. This is your host, Stephanie. I'm a licensed acupuncture physician and herbalist with a background in psychology, health sciences, and exercise physiology. Within my own spiritual awakening, I found myself learning pivotal lessons when I got myself to be in silence. Within that silence, the whispers came through. This is my sacred space of vulnerable storytelling where my guests and I share about the magic that comes from a life of following these whispers. I'm grateful you made it here, and I hope this show inspires you to live a life of following your own whispers. Let's get into the show. All right. Well, Dr. Steve, warm welcome to the show. This is going to be, I feel like this conversation is going to go deep. So I'm really grateful that you're here and you're willing to share your plethora of knowledge.
Sure, very happy to be here. Thank you for having me. And yeah, I think this will be a great collaboration.
Yay. Well, first, I would really love to start with your background. You shared a little bit during my reading, you shared a little bit about your background. And the snippet that you gave me was really fascinating. So I would love for you to share to the listeners so they can just get an idea of who you are and how you came to this point.
Sure. Yeah. It's interesting. When you go through things through life, you don't necessarily think that it's this big historic or big thing, right? And then when you look back, you're like, oh, wow, that happened. Oh, that happened, right? So it's interesting for me to kind of share that story because when I look back and I'm like, oh, yeah, that was actually some big stuff happening, right? So it really is simple. I basically um, started having health issues in my senior year in high school. I went from your typical overachiever to just no motivation, no energy, really kind of crazy to me. And so it was very stark. And so, long story short, I ended up in college, still feeling the same way. But that really was when I remember going to health food stores, reading the books. And this is the early 90s, right? So I graduated in 91, high school. So 90, that same year was in college. I remember making all kinds of potions and herbal teas. And I mean, so I was looking for my health and striving. And and I was just following, I was just reading books on health and vegetarianism and all, everything. And so that was my beginning. I ended up dropping out of college because I just was not functional. It was really just that bad. And so basically it was kind of like in TCM language, probably liver chi stagnation. There wasn't anything particular I was upset about. It was just I was no motivation. I just wanted to mope around all day and just read my books. And that was the only thing that kind of kept me sane. And so as a result of me searching, I ended up dropping out of school, ended up in Atlanta. After being about there 6, 7 months, someone said, "Hey, you should try some acupuncture." Didn't know what that was. Real long story short, within 6 months, I felt like a different person. I kind of felt like what I felt before. And I was so amazed by it. I said, okay, I've got to learn this. Whatever this is, I need to do this. And that began my journey. So I had kind of started the journey, but that really was when I found some mentors who had studied overseas in Sri Lanka. So I literally followed them. I was like a puppy. I was like, around 20, 23, 24 is when I found them, my mentor, and I just followed them, right? So they moved to Arizona. I moved to Arizona with them. And he was basically teaching like a apprentice master class. And as a result, I just followed him and his wife. Um, and they would give classes. I'd come, and part of their training was going overseas to Sri Lanka to do clinical trips, and I did two of those. And so that began my journey, right? And very fortunate in Sri Lanka was able to see acupuncture as you would see it, say, in China, right? They were doing all kinds of things there. They were doing what we call today acupuncture injection therapy. They were, with homeopathy, laser therapy. I mean, this is 1995, right? And so I didn't fully appreciate it then. I just was, okay, this is what we're doing, right? And so if I fast forward to today and I see all the culmination of that, I'm like, wait up, I was doing that back then. We were seeing, I mean, we got to see some amazing things back then. So so I just basically picked up because of my own health issues, trying to find clarity along my own way, right? Various diet trends, became vegan for 7 years, didn't do that, turned back around. Like I did everything, right? It really was. I even then, before I came back to school, well, excuse me, while I was in school, I went from being vegan vegetarian to eating meat, but in particular, I wanted to know where my food came from. So 2004, I started going to a local farm here in Florida. And me being who I am, I wanted to be really particular about it. So I actually started apprenticing on his farm. So I was milking cows, I was killing chickens, I was, making yogurt. So when I speak to people about these type of things, it's not just been, oh, I've done it. I milk cows. I make yogurt. I know how to kill chickens. I know how to, you know what I mean? So it comes from a really authentic place. And looking back on it, I was just trying to get healthy. I wasn't trying to anything other than that. And then each step along the way, I just realized now that it was a building block of my understanding. And so when I really speak to people and I try and communicate these things about why farm foods is really important, why animal protein is actually super important, right? I speak from a place of authority, right? Like I've been there, done that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I can speak to a lot of people's lives because I know where they're going because I was there, right?
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to kind of see a lot of these issues come back around again from when I was in my when I was in my 20s, right? And 30s, right? And to see now I'm 52 and it's really unusual for me to be the old guy on the block, if you will, which is fine. By the way, I say that really well. I have earned every single one of my years. I look forward to them. I look forward to having more. I love aging. I love aging because I've earned. I was trying to get to this place, if that makes sense, right? I was trying to get here, right? And now I'm here. so that's my journey. My journey was through actual you know, being there, doing it, having detours, bunny trails, getting back on track, getting right. So and all along the way, metaphysics came into it, astrology came into it when I was in Sri Lanka. So all these things were just signposts along the way, and it's just interesting to me to see how they've all kind of coalesced. And now when people talk about things, or if I talk, there's a file in my brain about that experience, right? And it's
Mm.
really interesting, and I really like to share with people because oftentimes let's put it this way, the past 30 years looking back, I see that we're just reliving things over again, right? And so now I feel I'm in a position that for people who want to learn, I'm willing to share my knowledge and experience with them, because oftentimes people are making the same mistakes. I can see it, and it's just like, and sometimes that's theirs to make, right? But then there's also people that are actually looking for answers, and I like to shortcut them. I was like, listen, here's a shortcut. You can get this way here, right? Because I know the suffering that comes along with it, right? And so that's kind of my story, right? So my story has transcended, kind of gone through all these elements, and astrology and acupuncture, farming, those are, I would say, the three pillars of my life. And those are the things I know very well.
I'm tempted to, in the intro, call you the acupuncturist, astrologer, farmer.
Right, right, right. That'd be kind of accurate. The other one I like to use is the metaphysician.
Ooh, I love that.
That's what I've considered myself. Anything metaphysical is kind of, even farming is really quite metaphysical when when you really connect with the land and you see the sun and the cycles and all that. I would say I probably learned as much about healing the body by being a farmer and being a farmer's apprenticeship and having that farm business for 14 years, as much as I was in acupuncture school, to be quite honest with you.
It makes sense. I recently did this podcast on Qigong, and I was learning how like some of the first Qigong forms ever were from farmers, just observing the land and having free time.
Yeah, I can see that. I can totally see that, right? They were doing the crane or the monkey or whatever, right? They were just observing. And I often have said that farming, when I was doing that, that's every time I would go up to the farm, it was about 3 hours north of here. I was loath to come back. I was just like, I'm just gonna stay here because this is
Mm.
I could easily do that even to this day. So but I obviously have a mission down here, so I'm okay with that. But still, it's um,
Yeah.
it's definitely a life. It's definitely a life. So yeah, that's where I come from.
All right, so I would love for us to start to segue into a little bit more astrology. So you mentioned that because I know that you mentioned to me kind of your first touch on astrology, but you didn't really get into it until you were studying in Sri Lanka, correct?
Correct, correct. So yeah. Mhm.
Take it away. Take it away. I
Oh,
want to hear
okay.
the story. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's so my first experience with Vedic astrology was in Sri Lanka. Um, went to, I guess, a local woman there that did it. I didn't know my birth time, so they did this really funky thing where they have you trace the shadow of your height in the sun. It was some crazy thing, like the shadow that your sun made, and then you have to walk a certain length, and they're able to extrapolate that to your birth chart.
What?
Yeah, exactly. I was like, wait, what? And she proceeded to give me a reading that was just blew my mind, right? So, but there was a language barrier there. A lot of it was written. It wasn't like what you and I, did, right? So anyway, I come back to the States, and then I get my first Vedic reading in the United States by an American, and that really blew my mind. He does palmistry as well, so he literally just grabbed my hand and he looked at my hand and he just says, "Okay, the first 7 years of your life, was spent on an island, and then you moved here." That is exactly what happened to me. I was born here, but grew up in Haiti from birth. You know, infant, I was sent back there, and then I came back to the States at 7 years old. Yeah.
I want to
So,
find a palmistriist or whatever the word is.
right? I mean, I was like, wait. And then he just read my chart. I felt like this guy was stalking me. Remind you, this is before Facebook and all this other stuff, right? So it's kind of like how you. So I ended up having my mom come out. I was living in California at the time. Had my mom come out, had him reading for him. I mean, it was just amazing. So I knew I was going to do something with that then. And then I was like, let me try and understand this. I had previous before, like most people try to get into Western astrology, and telling you, I got cross-eyed trying to make sense of the aspects and this, that. It was like, but I opened up Vedic astrology, I opened up the book, and it was just like, oh, this makes sense. Oh, I can do this.
Mm.
And it was so obviously I feel it was a past life. So anyway, that was early 2000s. And then, found a mentor, studied under him. I would say I probably had 3 or 4 mentors, right? That I really studied under. My last one was the one I studied under the most, from about 2008, and did about 4 years with him, and such. So yeah, so that's kind of how that started with Vedic astrology. So I started doing readings semi-professionally around 2004 or whatnot, and then in acupuncture school, right? So I've got a bunch of people in my database. They all have FCIM behind them because that's where that's where I did the readings. And so yeah, so I've been doing that, and then I slowly started incorporating some Western concepts, Western planets. I would say in the last 4 or 5 years, because as much as I'm very traditional, I'm very open to what works, right? And and very much the outer planets, in particular for me, Pluto, Uranus, I seem to have an affinity with those two, as they relate to different charts. So I use them quite often. Chiron, an asteroid. Um, but yeah, yeah. So that's why. So I do very traditional, if you will, but I also definitely, I'm open minded enough to use some other things at work.
And how would you explain the main difference between Vedic astrology and Western?
There are quite a few. Really, one is orientation, I would say. So, real quick history lesson. So, astrology in the West, as it was practiced, um, comes out of the ancient traditions of Egypt, Mesopotamia, blah, 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 right? That goes all the way up until about the Age of Enlightenment in the West, right? You have Greek passed it on to the Roman culture. Roman passed it on to the Arabic culture. So a lot of Arabic culture, Muslim culture, Islamic culture actually had a lot of astrology in it. Come the Age of Enlightenment, literally Western society diverges. They start persecuting astrologers. They basically say, "Hey, we're scientists, right? This is some crazy stuff. We're not." And so the Age of Enlightenment basically means a decline of astrology. And it wasn't until the mid 1800s or so that astrology, as we know today, kind of got pulled back together, but without its ancient roots, right?
Mm.
It was almost reconstructed. And so it left a lot of the traditional stuff. Why is that important? Because Indian astrology has not changed for the most part. It still has a lot of the understandings and philosophies behind it as traditional Greek, Rome, like all these pre Enlightenment time periods. And so what happens is there was no Uranus, there was no Neptune, right? Those are all modern astrology. So Western astrology today, as it's practiced, has a much more psychological bent. They really have an issue with free will, where like, oh my God, this is fated. You know what I mean? So you kind of get this thing where people are like, oh, you're telling people that, well, yeah, that's what we do. We read fates, and that would not have been unusual to an ancient Vedic astrology or an ancient Greek astrologer. They would have been like, yeah, this is the chart. What do you say? Whereas modern is very much psychologically oriented and such. It has its uses, right? But that was not astrology. That underpinning was very quite different. And so what you're seeing now is a return to traditional astrology. So you'll see Hellenistic astrology and things like that. So modern Western astrology, as it's practiced today, its focus is on the sun sign. Sidereal Vedic astrology is focused on the moon position, right? So that's very different, right? So what does the sun represent in astrology, Western and Eastern, right? Is the will, right? How can you make an effort to change things, and where are you putting your energy towards? Whereas the moon is, what's your experience of life,
Mm.
right? That's the moon, right? How do you feel about X, Y, and Z circumstances in your life, right? So you can look in a chart. If the person has a full moon, a very bright moon in the chart, and and there are challenging things in the life, that person is happy. That person still has a lot of juice to take on the challenges of life. Whereas if you see a very weak or afflicted moon, and there are a lot of quote unquote good things in the chart, right? Really good things, money, that person, the ability for that person to enjoy that and feel good about their life is really different, right? And that's a very different aspect. Two different things about Western versus Eastern astrology, right? The moon focus. Not that the sun is not there, obviously, in ours, it is, but that's one difference. The other difference is very predictive based. Vedic astrologers, people come to us to get very concrete effects of the karmas and how they will play out, right? And I'm just thinking to myself, like every morning I start off just looking at different charts of say what's going on in the world. And if I have the birth data on certain things, I look and you can see it, right? You can see certain things. I'll give you a perfect example. When Israel, everything's going on with Israel, October 7th, the attack, so on and so forth. A year before that happened, um, my intuition was like, I know what it was. Pluto was moving into a new sign. It was moving from Capricorn to Aquarius. And I said, okay, let me see all the countries where and how will that impact them. So I have about 30 country charts. And so I just started looking to see, okay, Pluto is going here. That means when I got to Israel's chart, I was like, whoa, Pluto, the planet of power, and it's a very scorpionic energy about negative eighth house power struggles and death and resurrection, and these type of transformational energies, right? That's Pluto. Um, was going to square, which I both know is a very difficult aspect, to Israel's first house. I was like, uh-oh, right? And it was going to go back and forth for about a good 2 years. I knew right then and there that Israel was going to go under dramatic change, that by the time that got out, that it was going to be a different country, right? And then when the October 7th attack happened, I was like, here we go, right? It was actually happening a bit before that, because the power dynamic struggle, if people remember correctly,
Mm-hmm.
was there was this big uprising in Israel. Why? Because they wanted to restructure, the conservatives wanted to restructure their Supreme Court and the judiciary system. And there were en masse protests in Israel. Like it was shutting down the country, right? It wasn't any minor thing. This was happening before the war going on here, right? So there was already these deep Plutonian energies being brought to the surface. You see what I mean? And that's what a Vedic astrologer does. We look at things and we like, there's that's happening, right? Western would probably have a more different take, right? They probably see, but we just look at it very starkly. And I was like, okay, Israel's going through it, right? Israel's going to go through it, and it will be transformed as a nation because it's its first house. So their identity will be transformed over these next really 20 years, right? But initial. So that's how it's different from Western, right? Western, I feel is kind of its its value in terms of understanding certain dynamics. Vedic is like here are the karmas, right? And we delineate them as best as we can to our ability, and then how you can mitigate them, what you're working with. I like to tell people that we predict the astrological weather, right? And then we say, okay, you may want to have an umbrella, something like that. So I would say that would be some of the big differences.
Okay. Okay. That makes
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense. Wow, that I got chills when you mentioned that. That's yeah, like it really is all fated in more ways than I think we want to admit.
It's
But
a challenge. It's a challenge. I will tell you that Vedic astrology, as it changed me. It made me much more understanding person, compassionate person. I mean, judgmental in one ways because you have to, I have to make judgments on calls. Like, so I'm not gonna be, but it also makes me much more accepting because I'm like, oh, okay, well, that needs to be in this world as well, right? Like
Mhm.
all the quote unquote good and the bad that we see, that's part of this interplay of existence, right? So there's a beauty in it, and so it's changed me. It really has. It's just I was like, oh my goodness, like wait, what does that mean? Yeah, it's very deep.
I mean, your reading changed me, just giving me insight into the thing that I, in a lot of ways, resist the most. I did a whole podcast on it. The thing I resist the most is actually what I'm here for, and I set it up for it to be a special challenge. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, it just changed the way I see myself and everything. But I wanted to ask, do the planets have similar personalities with Western compared to Vedic?
Yes. So yeah, yes. So for instance, the sun will still be the sun, the moon will be the sun for sure, for sure. I don't think there's really any different delineations. There might be different emphasis on certain things, but no, Mercury's still the planet of communication and so on. So that's still the same for sure. Western again uses Neptune, Pluto, and
Gotcha.
Uranus, right? So that's the only difference. We don't have those in traditional Vedic.
Okay. Could we go over a couple more of the planets and the personalities? Because then I would love to kind of segue into Mercury retrograde, or not Mercury retrograde, Saturn return. Um,
Oh,
but before I do that, I would love to just like have a little bit of a reference point of, because I know that Saturn and Jupiter kind of have this interplay as well. And yeah, just to help
oh.
me, but also help the listener kind of create these characters here.
Well, and I'm glad that you use that term because that's how I describe them, right? I'll sometimes say, oh, they're superheroes with their superpowers, right? There are actors on the stage. So yes, in Vedic astrology, we actually say that they actually have consciousness, right? The sun has a consciousness, the moon has a consciousness, and I will tell you that there's things that I've come across lately from the scientific community, right? That basically kind of speaks to that. I'm like, oh my goodness, they're actually, yeah, the
What?
sun is conscious, right? It's really for those listeners who want to kind of jump into that a little bit, look up and Google electric universe and the electric sun. I'll just leave it at that because it's such an amazing rabbit hole to go into. But it's actually experiments done by real scientists, physicists, that basically they're starting to realize, wait up, we can't account for certain scientific anomalies, and the only thing that accounts for it potentially is consciousness. And so they're like, wait, what? So it's kind of mind blowing. So
I'm sure
anyway,
that's hurting their brains, especially the scientists.
I love it. I love having that because for me, I don't have any dichotomy between being a metaphysician and being a hardcore scientist. If you talk if people know about me when they come to my classes, Dr. Moreau is about hardcore science. Like I'm talking about studies. I want to see the evidence, right? Um, but there's a way that there's a meeting point between the two, right? So long story short, plants are conscious. So, let's start with the beginning, right? So there's a reason why the sun is the king, right? Because literally without the sun, nothing happens, right? The reason that we have the zodiac, right? The zodiac is the band of stars, right? That follows the ecliptic. The ecliptic is literally the path of the sun through the stars. The path that the sun takes is the path of the zodiac. It goes through Sagittarius, Aquarius, and so on and so forth. So the sun is a set, it's the leader that we all follow. So I like to tell people that basically astrology is poetic astronomy,
Hmm.
right? That's really what it is. So what you see up there in the sky, if a poet is looking at it, he's going to say, "Oh, I see that this sun is being eclipsed. So the power of the sun is being taken away from it." And so the sun as the king, if in ancient times the astrologer did not predict when solar eclipse was going to come, they cut their heads off. There's documented cases of that happening, absolutely, in China, in India, because that was a threat to the ruler. That at that point in time, there could have been an overthrow, a coup d'etat, right? A power grab from, some other people, right? And
Hmm.
so that's the symbolism of the sun, the symbolism, traditional authority as a male sign, right? The father figure, right, is the sun, right? So these type of things. Then, of course, we get the moon. Now, the moon is really interesting because we love watching the full moon, right? And what's interesting about that, the reason why it symbolizes women right? The main reason why it symbolizes women is that when you see a bright full moon, where does that light come from? It's the reflected light of the sun. And so that ability to be that receptive and then have things bounce off of you, that means that the moon becomes the receptive partner to the king. And so the moon is a queen, right? And so that just those analogies like that, right? It's like, oh, there's a beauty in describing it that way, right? So everything connected with that. And obviously the cycle of women, you know, on the monthly cycle, that 28 days, that's literally the cycle of the moon through each month, right? That's even the word month, month, moon. That's literally what that where that comes from, right? Menses, right? So all these things. So there's women. Anything that talks about growth, right? So early childhood, right, is ruled by the moon, right? The moon rules liquids, so milk, right? That comes from a cow. That's full of liquid, right? So these analogies go on and on. Then the sun and the moon have a child. I'm loosely paraphrasing here, and that becomes Mercury.
Mm.
Mercury is the child of the celestial family, right? It's the young one. And what do kids do at a certain age? Why? Why that? Why mom? Why that? Right? They have this facility of just language and curiosity, right? And they never shut up. That's Mercury, right? And it's right. That's a Mercury, right? And so our ability to talk and speak and communicate, right? And also, what do kids do? They're so malleable, right? They're hyper suggestible, right? They become. I mean, when I was a little kid, we go in my mom's closet, my dad's closet, and we would play, which is a Mercury thing, and put on little skits, Mercury, right, of our family friends, right? And so come out dressed in this da da da, right? And we would parody and play for our friends and they would have to guess who we were playing, right? And that's Mercury, right? Mercury is a playful, the trickster. It's, and hence one of the reasons that it rules actors. Why? Because actors play a role, and the good actors, you believe them when they are X, Y, and Z, and then you believe them when they turn around it, right? Because they're able to literally change their energy, and that's what a Mercury is. Mercury is the ability to be changeable. So, do you want me to continue with all of them, or just that's
Well, which
idea?
one? Let's
Yeah, more than happy to. I just yeah.
yeah, well, okay. Well, actually, something that I find really fascinating that Vanita said a few times. I would love to hear what you say, and I'm sorry if I'm
No,
calling you out,
no, no.
Vanita, but Mars. Something that
Yeah.
she talks about is like Mars versus Jupiter. Just I think especially, everyone, at least at my age, they're either in a relationship, married, or like, what the fuck? Um, and something that Vanita said to me was that your Mars is your boyfriend, but your Jupiter, or your girlfriend, and Jupiter is your husband, and that your
Mhm.
Mars and your Jupiter won't be the same. And I thought that was, and I'll say that to friends every once in a while if they're like, I can't find the person. I'm like, well, maybe you should look outside the box because maybe your Jupiter is not going to be your Mars. So could you touch on that dynamic there?
Sure. Yeah, so it is interesting. So Jupiter, um, in a woman's chart, right, traditionally is considered the idea when they think of the kind of guy they want to be with, right? Jupiter as an ideal, right? Not necessarily perfect, but just kind of, oh, I kind of see me with this kind. This is kind of stuff I'm interested in, right? What they like. That's Jupiter, right? Um, and Mars literally will be like the bad boy, right? They're both male planets, right? And they're both hot planets, right? Um, but Mars is that quick fire, right? That's just the quick, intense energy and yeah, motivation, right? Mars actually rules. Mars is the planet of sex, like the actual act itself, right? So that excitement, that vitality, right? Jupiter actually also has that quality as well, and someone with very strong Jupiter actually has very strong sex drive. That's why you see some a lot of prominent men, right, with very strong Jupiters, they get into trouble if their Jupiter is afflicted and things like that, right? But back to our story here. So yes, so that Mars is that planet of just that quick, right, gratification, if you will, whereas
Mhm.
Jupiter is that longer lasting, the deeper values, the what women may be looking for in terms of long term, you see?
Hmm.
And so going towards that placement where it's located in the chart, right? Now, again, in Vedic astrology, that depends on how well disposed it is, you see? Now, Vedic astrology and any astrology, really, you never go on just one indication. But if I look in a chart and I look at Jupiter and it's massively afflicted, I know that that woman has had difficulty, right, um, in attracting the right person. Um, yeah, it's afflicted. And what affliction basically means is that energy in the chart is not able to manifest in the way that we would want it to manifest, right? It could be afflicted by Mars, and so there's more fighting and friction, right? It could be afflicted with one of the nodes, the north node or the south node, which would cause different things. And so that's basically what you look at. And again, that's just one factor. You could still look at other things. Um, there are other factors in the chart that would mitigate that, right? That would say that, okay, it's difficult in the beginning, and with effort, it can turn around, right? So I never want to let people know, even with Vedic astrology, there are definite karmas that can absolutely change, right? So you never make a prediction on just one thing alone, right? But as a general rule, yes, you look to see Jupiter in a woman's chart, right? To see, you know, are they able to attract that person and the person that they're attracted to, right? Because it basically tells you the type of man that they're going to attract, right? Are they going to attract the lower level vibe, or are they going to, the one that really suits their needs and is going to be long-term partner material, right? And actually be partnering to them, right? In a loving way, which is very what Jupiter represents.
I
Very much.
see. Um, okay, that helps clear it up. Gosh, there was something that I was thinking. Oh, I was thinking of how I've told quite a few people, anyone that will really listen about my reading.
Thank
And
you.
and I've had quite a few people say, "Oh, I'm way too afraid to figure it. Like, I'm gonna find out I'm gonna be alone in this life and blah blah blah." And what I say in response and like finding out everything that you said that was really difficult, I already knew. I was already living it. And it was really good to know what's to come. And in my instance, I think timing was everything for me because I knew that there was good to come. And like that was the point where I was like, oh, look, I didn't know that. And it really brought me relief. But one thing I really love about how you do it and what Vanita told me too is that you like if you see something unfavorable or whatever it was, you don't settle with that. You understand that there are ways to work around the planets. And on that note, um, I would love for you to just say like if I were a dummy, in astrology, how the planets in because I'm sure people are just like, oh, astrology, constellations, and like Virgo versus Capricorn and stuff like that. But with the planets, there's just always this dance and interplay, like you said, like a characters in a play. So I would love for you to explain how these planets influence our lives across our life, and I don't know if I'm
Yeah,
formulating the
it
right
makes sense.
question, but
Yeah.
yeah, I'll let you take go for it from there.
Yeah, this is one of the things I have actually. I think about most. I think often on, meditate on, and just kind of as I'm daydreaming, driving. It's like, how's this really, right? I can't say I have all the answers, but I feel like I got some, right, or at least come to some understanding. One way of looking at it is these are not external forces that are outside of us, right? The chart is a representation of you, of the interplays and energies within you. There is a sun consciousness within you. There is a Mercury consciousness within you, right? These faculties exist. What the chart is representing is how well is that functioning, right? So the planet out there is not doing something to you, right? Um, and so that helps somewhat because what it means is that in one of the things that alchemical processes and all these rituals and all was ways of purifying that energy, coming to an understanding of what that energy is and how to use it appropriately, right? So, perfect example. So, if someone has a Mercury retrograde and it's afflicted, that means their speech is difficult, right? If it's afflicted by Mars, then they speak harshly or without thinking, and those type of things hurt people's feelings. Well, right then and there, that compulsion is there as a default for people, right? Someone who has a Mercury, Mars, and so on, right? But here's the deal: you can, through your free will, work on, okay, I'm not going to say that. Oh, I'm going to, you can train yourself, right? It takes effort, right? Your default setting is to talk, right? Or to say something without thinking. But you can, through your own efforts, right, change that, right? It takes time. It takes your willpower. And that's where the free will comes in, right? So in that sense, this is how the planets are working, right? They are faculties within us that we can then represent by the chart. Is that making sense?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
So that's one way. Now, the more challenging way of looking at it is when you start seeing, are able to see different aspects by transits, meaning where are the planets currently right now in the sky and how they are affecting in your chart, right? So we're going to segue into Saturn returns and Saturn, right? Saturn right now is in Pisces. And so if you have, sensitive planets or any planet there, right? But let's say the sensitive planets are the ones that rule yourself, the sun, your ascendant ruler, your moon, right? Maybe the eighth house ruler or whatever, right? Those type of things. Well, the Saturn is going to do its Saturn thing, which is pressures, delays, obstacles. You will feel that, right? So it's almost like a cosmic clock that will tell you when you will have certain karmas to deal with, right?
Mm.
So you never have to not know when certain things will happen, right? I made a prediction for myself earlier this year when I saw Saturn was going to have a negative aspect to my sun, right? Saturn represents obstacles, delays, pressures, right? Sun representing the government. So I anticipated something. I was like, oh, okay, let me, right? So I'm, making sure everything's good, right? um, One of the things, remedial measures you can do is actually you can have these pujas done, right? These done in absentia in India. So I had one done, right, just to kind of hopefully help out. Didn't know what. All of a sudden, towards the end of that puja, I had an idea in my head to go just check my mail. I rarely check mail. I get what I need, right? So I decided to go check. There was a something from the IRS where I owed some money. And that very much is a Saturnian thing, right? Unexpected, right? So that was going to happen, right? Now, the free will here part is where I was able to get head up's notice, and therefore I was able to arrange things to where it wasn't as big of a hit. Is that
Mm.
making sense?
Oh yeah, and that's been this year the most challenging and painful thing is not like things just coming out of
Yes.
nowhere as with hindsight I see actually it wasn't coming out of nowhere, it was building up, but it's almost like the looking at the charts here, it provides a hindsight in a weird way before it even happens.
It does. It really does. You're like, oh, okay. Saturn is transiting my first house. So first house is the body. So we know that there'll be some health issues potentially this year that you just want to be on top of. Now, here's the thing. If someone is 90 and Saturn is aspecting, yeah, then we're talking, certain more negative events going on, or at least transitioning to the other side, right? That's just common sense, right?
Right.
Whereas if you're 14 in Saturn, maybe a broken bone, or you're down with the flu during football season, or whatever the case, right? There's still common sense here, right? It's not like, oh my God, Saturn's coming to first house, you're gonna die. No, it doesn't mean that, right?
Right.
So that's hopefully that answers a little bit of the question.
It does.
Yeah.
Okay, so what the heck is Saturn return?
This is fun. Saturn returns. Let me tell you, since I knew we were going to have this conversation, I was thinking, okay, how am I going to talk about this? And, it's been since the last time. And it just occurred to me. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. So Saturn by itself, right? What actor is this on the stage? Yeah. So the symbolism of Saturn, of course, it's the planet all the way furthest away, right? So it doesn't get as much light from the sun. So it's cold, dry, right? Dark, right? Imagining a light that's kind of not going all the way back to the cabinet, right? You just can't quite see it. So cold, dry energy, right? Interestingly enough, it's the only one visibly that we can see that has rings. And what are rings? Something restricting. So Saturn has this restrictive quality to it, right? So all these things represent that. So Saturn represents boundaries, right? And keeper of boundaries and cycles of where things begin and end. So that's why Saturn rules death, right? Because Saturn tells you, okay, time for you to come in, but also time for you to go out, right? Because there's a time to that. It's time. You're only here for a certain period of time. Saturn rules all things related to boundaries and time, timekeeping cycles, death, destruction, endings, right?
Mm.
And so that case, but it also rules deepness, heaviness, heaviness of thought, right? Of action, where, a very good positive Saturn, this is person, we literally say they are the salt of the earth or they're down to earth, right? There's no pretension about them. They're just going to give it to you straight, um, honesty, right? Humility, right? There's a certain like, okay, I'm not going to do above and beyond. I'm just going to, okay, just be very straight with you, right? And that's Saturn. So a really good Saturn gives qualities of humbleness. You can trust people with Saturn, right? They're not going to cheat you, right? If it's a proper
Mm.
function Saturn, right? A negative Saturn actually will betray you, right? So that's actually one thing. But so that's the difficulties of Saturn, right? In terms of its negatives, but also its positives. Saturn is planning, organizing, long-term structure, long-term planning, right? That's why it rules farmers, right? Because farmers have to know I'm going to plant today and this seed will come here. Okay. And at that time, I have to have something prepared, right? You look at the cycle of the moon and the stars, right? With traditional farming, right? There are certain seasons when you do certain plantings, right? And such. So that's what Saturn represents. Saturn return is Saturn transits a sign. It takes about 2.5 years in each sign. And therefore, for Saturn to make a full transit of the chart is about 30 years, right? So Saturn return is when Saturn returns to the position it was in your chart. And that is when a person will experience a Saturn return. Saturn return is a maturing influence. It's Saturn saying, okay, let's check to see if you're on track with your destiny. Saturn represents destiny, right? And what have you been doing with your time in these first 30 years? And are you on course? And if you're not on course, it creates these course corrections. Is that making sense? That's
Mm-hmm.
what that 2.5 year Saturn is about. It's about course correcting you to say, hey, you need to get more serious about life. Let's figure, right? Okay, let's do over here. That's why, it happens basically 27 to 30, 29 to 30, right? Depending on, right? But it's your late 20s, early 30s, right? That transition time, where you're like, okay, if life has not been going as you want it, you get serious about it. Like, okay, I want to make these changes, right? And that's what Saturn represents, the seriousness of that. How does it do that? It does that by Saturnian means, pressure, delays, obstacles, right? Um, and the things that come to bear with Saturn is basically saying, is this built on a good foundation? Saturn is testing that, right? That's why that you feel that pressure. The other way I like to describe it is if you want to develop muscles, you have to lift heavy weights. And the fact of doing that strengthens you, right? So Saturn is looking to strengthen you. That's what Saturn is all about, ultimately. And Saturn returns are those specific times of life where it's orientating you towards, okay, let's get you back on track, right? So the first one happening around 30, um, you know, people get serious about life. Oh, I need to get back to school, or this situation is not working out for me. I want to change careers, right? Anything you've been kind of dissatisfied with. And so that maturing influence, think of it almost like a kind of like another puberty, right? Where you're kind of growing into your body physically, right? Third, Saturn return is almost growing to your body emotionally, spiritually as well. That's probably the best way to describe another way of describing Saturn return. Okay, that's the first one. The next one that you get coming up close to 60 is okay. You've lived 60 years so far, right? what's the second, the rest of your life going to be about? It orientates you towards eldership, right? Being an elder, right?
Mm.
That accumulated wisdom, folk. That's when people start getting, um, well, some people get even more spiritually aware, right? Okay, what is this about, right? You look back and you're like, you've had more time behind you than you could potentially have ahead of you, right? So mortality in a real way during the second Saturn return becomes really significant, right?
Mm.
Um, and so, my mom had her health scare at 50, actually 59, 60, right? When I was in acupuncture school, right? She had to do, she pretty much did the 180 on a lot of her health, right? Um, so though you'll find quite often that happens. And if you're very fortunate to get a third one, you're gonna be 90, right? And so that's a beautiful thing as well, right? It's like, okay, now, you're super elder, right? Like, okay, there is power. Saturn's power comes from experience. There is something about when you know something from having done it and you describe it, you talk to people, it emanates from you. That's the power of Saturn, right? You kind of see that, right? It's like,
Yeah.
and you can feel it because people embody that energy and it ripples out through their energy field, right? And that's what you're developing when you get your first Saturn return, right? You're developing those muscles. If that makes sense, right? Now, again, depends how well disposed your Saturn is, right? But here's the thing that's happening during Saturn return. At the same time people are having their Saturn return, there's also at 27 for everybody, their Mars is maturing as well, right? And so this is a concept that only Vedic astrology has. Western does not have this concept, and it's really real. Every planet matured. They call it the great year for that planet. So every year for everybody, 15, 16 is Jupiter. Age 21, 22 is the sun. 23, 24 is moon. 24, 25 is Venus. You'll find often when people say, oh, they got married in their mid-20s, I know they got married at 24, right? Maybe 23, right? Almost, I would say 90% of the time, they're like, oh, yeah, I got married at 24. I'm like, okay, yep, maybe 25, right? Venus matures. What Venus represents in your chart, right, allows you to know how well that is happening for you, right? And again, the whole part about free will versus fated, right? That is just something that's fated. Like you can see and you can make an easy prediction with people like that, right? Anyway, 31 is when Mercury matures. So think about that. 27, Mars is maturing. At the same time, people are probably going through their Saturn return, maybe a year or two after that, for 2.5 years. And then right after that, you may slide right into your Mercury maturing. So this is why, the late 20s, early 30s are very fraught with change in people's lives, right? We've all heard about the 27 Club of
Mm.
rock and rolls, and right, with that very unfortunate thing. They all pass at approximately 27 years old. Oh God, there's a bunch of them, right? But you know what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm. I do.
Um, 27, Mars is maturing, right? Mars is a planet of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's literally what it represents, right? And that
Uh-huh.
partaking of drugs, the alcohol, all that's a very Mars thing, right? And so those people's Mars are very afflicted to the point where, unfortunately, it causes their demise, right? So I don't want the listeners to think and rush off and see like, oh my God, no. It's very specific conditions that occur. So it's not, obviously that doesn't happen to everybody, right?
Mhm.
Um, but that's what the Saturn return is. Saturn return is a course correction and is saying, hey, is this built on a good foundation? And if it is, the pressure, it withstands the pressure. If it's not, it doesn't handle the pressure, right? And it goes by the wayside because it's really preparing you and saying, hey, it's a wake up call, basically. Let's get serious about life. That's what a Saturn return is.
That I got emotional a few points there because, I've really been feeling victimized by Saturn. And or rather the Saturn within. And
Yeah.
hearing you discuss who Saturn is as a planet, the characteristics, it gave me a lot of respect for
Yes,
Saturn and
absolutely.
and thinking, oh, well, I'm not going to talk shit about Saturn anymore. Actually, Saturn is like, you know,
I
uh,
love when you said that. Yeah, it's true.
yeah. And then just realizing that it really is this dry, tough love. And it's for like it's again, it just reminds me that inner locus of control versus the external or outer locus of control. It's all happening for me and it's
Yes.
by me through me. And it's just such a great reminder, I think.
Those of us who are trying to live more consciously aware, it is an extra burden. I won't say extra, it's just a burden, right? To kind of be like, oh, okay, that's really what that is. All right. Um, we're all on different levels of awareness, right? So the person who's quote unquote below me is not below, right? They're just everyone's on a different path, right? But yes, when you start having that awareness that it is within you and that's right, it is for you, it takes a little bit of this thing out, right? And definitely gives you that respect and also like, okay, let me take this serious, which is what Saturn is about, right? Like, okay, all right, like, what do I need to do here? Even if you just let it percolate a little bit, like, okay, all right, let me, okay, what's happening here, right? Because it does what it's supposed to do, which is slow you down, right? That's
Mhm.
actually what Saturn is, right? It's like, oh, all right. Now, let me describe another way that I like to describe Saturn. Jupiter is this expansive energy, right? So Jupiter is like, hey, you have all these opportunities all in front of you. It gives you, right? That's what Jupiter does, right? Santa Claus, here, have more. Um, Saturn is literally the opposite. Saturn shrinks our field of awareness, right? It says no. Stop focusing on those things. That's not important. Focus on this, right? So your field of vision shrinks, right? But when you start understanding that's just getting rid of the external things that are distracting you, that actually becomes good because then you can focus, right? It's when we resist that. And so it took me a while to kind of start realizing, oh, wait up. Yeah, I've been wanting to just be able to focus on X, Y, and Z. And the fact that that's off my plate because Saturn took it off my plate, right? That's really the power of Saturn of shrinking your focus. It's not getting rid of things to get rid of them. It wants to say, okay, I want you to just focus on this, marshal your resources on this. And then you can get things done, right? You can't build anything lasting in this world without a good Saturn, right? So uh, that's why Saturn represents those deep things and limited choices.
Thank you, Saturn.
Thank you, Saturn. Yes.
And then is it natural for the Christmas to come after the Grinch for everybody?
You know what? Not always. I'm not going to say it's always going to be like that, but generally, once you learn the lessons of Saturn, right, then your life is on track. You see, your life is put on the track that it was meant to do. You are going to be on the track of your destiny,
Hmm.
and that's always a good thing, right?
Yeah.
It's always a good thing. Um, and so, you know, someone like yourself that's again consciously aware, that already means you have your Jupiter is higher functioning, right? So it's there. It's just like, oh, okay, I'm just gonna move you over here. We need to tweak a little thing here, right? And it's learning to accept what Saturn's trying to teach us, and the less resistance there is to that, the easier it'll be. Doesn't always make it, hunky dory, right? So I always
Mhm.
like to say Saturn's not the lovey-dovey planet, right? But he or she, well, I like to say is he's going to be there for you though, right? He doesn't leave. Like Saturn is like, okay, I'm in your corner, right? I got you, right? It's always
Yeah.
going to have your back. So you're right. It really is a respect towards Saturn of like, oh, okay, there we go.
Hmm.
Thank you. So
It makes me think of today. I went to an Al-Anon meeting, which is for loved ones of addicts, and I'm working through the first step. And the first step is just admitting you are powerless and life has become unmanageable in the way that you have been operating within it. And I had this epiphany of realizing, because I was sitting there, everyone's sharing, and I'm the youngest one there, and I'm thinking, God, I wish I could have something to say that I did well this week, that everyone will be like, "Oh, good job, Steffi." But I didn't. But I realized as I heard everyone spoke, I was like, "Oh, it's not about what did I do right, it's what did I notice that no longer works. And I'm realizing hearing you say that too, it's just again painting the picture of Saturn's not about doing it all right. It's about stripping and shedding and noticing what is no longer serving.
Yes, yeah, that excellent. You said it perfectly. You said it perfectly. Yeah, that's very much a Saturn faculty ability. It's interesting. We work with the seven planets, right? And I say that the days of the week planets, right? Because I tell people all the time, you're doing astrology, you don't even know it, right? And I know you know that, right? So it's like the days of the week, Monday through Saturday, Sunday through Saturday, I should say. And then you have the North Node, South Node, they call it the eclipses. So we work with nine planets, if you will, right? It's amazing how I'm kind of losing a little bit of train of thought with that Saturn, but it's amazing how this is how it was set up, and they're able, even to this day, even without again Neptune, Uranus, any of these other planets, right? You can still talk about all types of things, right, that are relevant to this day. So it's almost like how we have in TCM the five elements, and we're able to categorize illness and such with those. You do the same thing with the worldly phenomenon, right? Spiritual phenomenon with those nine planets. And that's what's really cool, I find about that. Like, how did they come up with this beautiful system, right? Um, it has to be divinely orchestrated, and that always gives me peace. It really does, because as crazy as X, Y, and Z goes on in the world, I realize there's a bigger order to it all, and that's always very comforting to me.
Yes, I think it's it gets us out of our own myopic story to look at how are we contributing to the big picture, not just for this lifetime and these people, but all the lifetimes and everyone that's come and is yet to come.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Agreed. And so it gets to your point of like what you're thinking about at your meeting. Like, you come to a place of gratitude and awareness, and it's like, oh, that's what it was about, just being aware. And it's like it, yeah, it's just these small, simple things we don't think is important, or it's like, oh, that's just that. It's like, no, that is a thing, right? And again, so that's why Saturn represents being by yourself, being alone, right? Because when there's no distractions, when you're just by yourself, you only have your thoughts, right? And somehow all that stuff gets shaken out. Like, you're by yourself enough, long enough, you become wise, right? Just because there's it's self-organizing, right? It's kind of way, and certain people are put into timeouts, as in like they're imprisoned or something, right? It's the way of the universe saying, okay, literally timeout, right? You need to be by yourself, right? Um, Whether they transgressed or not, or what. I often think about the people who are unfairly put in prison, right?
Mm.
And and I mean, no means, I mean, that is such an injustice of epic proportions. But I remember hearing several of them saying that was the best thing that happened to me, because I could blah, blah, blah. And I was like, wait, what? That's a person who has gained wisdom. That's Saturn. If you want to see Saturn in action, that's that person. What? You, yeah, that's
Wow.
that's powerful, right? He said, so I heard him say that, and I literally was just like blown by it away. I was like, whoa, okay. Wow. So yeah, Saturn.
Saturn. And wow, that really ooh, it just like ties it all in because this whole podcast is called The School of Whispers. And that name came to me when I went on my first solo trip. I went to a little cabin in Asheville for a couple of days, and in the middle of the night, I just heard like I woke up to hearing a voice say that, and I was like, "Oh, is that what I'm doing right now?" By just shutting off everything and everyone and being alone with myself for hours and hours throughout the day, I realized once my mind kind of ran out, I was able to listen to other things and not just the whispers of my body, but the whispers of the world around me. And so that's really cool. It's like Saturn is the planet of whispers in a way.
I love that. Yeah, there you go. There you go. That's deep. Yeah, yeah. There's a lot to be learned in, when we're by ourselves and quiet.
Mm, cool. Well, I'm this conversation helped me so much. It's not that I'm asking Saturn to stay any longer than he's welcome, but I am super grateful and very like in reverence,
Yeah.
in reverence and awe to this planet.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I would agree with you.
Before I do I do two closing questions. Before I get into those, is there anything else along what we've discussed here that feels worth mentioning?
Oh, well, did you want to talk about the Uranus United States thing or
Oh, yes. Yes,
I
please. Yes,
wasn't sure. That's
please.
why I had it in my brain. So I was,
Yes, absolutely.
okay. All right. Do you want to set it up or
Now you go for it. You'll do it better
okay.
than me.
So this is an interesting thing because this is encapsulates kind of what we're going through as a country that we've been basically since 2016 and really probably a little before that, right? But we're coming into it. So this, interestingly enough, is when I learned the outer planets and started understanding them. Because again, when you see something, the cycles of it come through so distinctively, you're like, okay, I got to pay attention to this. So this has to do in the United States chart with the planet Uranus. So the planet Uranus is was actually discovered around the same time the United States was initiated and settled as a country or became a United States. 17, whatever it was, 1776, whatnot.
Mhm.
Uranus is a planet of revolution, uh, change, upheaval, right? Suddenness, right? But also innovative, right? So it's not always just negative, but there's a sudden thing to it. Think about like a lightning flash, whoosh, right? Um, and the upheaval that it causes in its wake, and that's one of the things Uranus represents. So when the United States was born, Uranus was in Gemini. And it's an 84-year cycle. So every 84 years, we experience a Uranus return, right? That's basically what this is. And so every time Uranus is in Gemini for the United States, these have been the notable things that have occurred. It's a 7-year transit. Um, and so the first one was literally the founding of America, right? The very first one, which very apropos, right? 84 years later was the American Civil War. 84 years after that was 1941, World War II. We are about to have the fourth one, 2026 to 2032, 33, right? That whole year, 26 to 32. That's 7 years, starting in 2026. And so one of the things that has always occurred then has always been some type of conflict. The United States has always been involved in some type of conflict. So that right there is going to be will be part of this. But here's the thing. There's always context to all of these things, right? It's not just like death, destruction, war, right? That's not, but look at it overall. What happened? The first time the United States got its freedom, right? From the oppressive, colonial British royalty and all that. They wanted to rule themselves, right? And then 84 years after that, the ideal of this country, all men are created equal, but some people were not, enslaved people and women, right? And so the American Civil War was fought to free, right? That's an element. So that restructured the country, right? That's actually what Uranus represents. So it's a restructuring. Now they weren't completely free, right? But at least the abject bondage, if you will. Then 84 years after that, World War II, that was another restructuring. The United States became kind of preeminent world power, right? And the seeds of the civil rights movement was seeded by these guys fighting and then coming back and then fighting for their own rights in this country, right? So it transformed America, right? It transformed who we were. It made us closer to the ideals of what we set this to be.
Mm.
And so I'd imagine that this next one coming up, 2026 to 2032, right? That's going to be the same thing. People say that it's going to be the end of America. No, I really don't see that. I really see it as restructuring this country for it to be closer to its ideals, if you will, right?
Mm.
That's one part. But I bring this up because, since 2016, people have been talking about, oh my God, it's going. I'm like, first of all, this is a marathon, not a sprint, right? And if you get all burnt out now, trust me, we have not seen anything yet, right? And that's what's hard for people to understand. And as an astrologer, I just say that I'm like, I don't know what to tell you. This is Here's the history. Here's so when I hear people kind of like, well, it's coming like, no, there's gonna be war. There's gonna be a problem, right? Like, but then how do we adjust and how do we out of but look at what's coming out of that. We're seeing this big movement with local farms and small communities, tiny homes, more sustainability, right? Even with the difficulties that are right that are projected, it's an opportunity to us kind of get back to a lot of the roots of what this country was about in terms of, and also embrace new ones, right? So this is a transformational opportunity for us, right? One of the things that I've been passionate about since I was 19 is about our food supply and eating healthy food, right? You're seeing that where they're talking about seed oils as a problem now. Like, it's like, I never would have imagined that. Like, I was hoping they would start getting around to that, right? Things like this, right? So there are still a lot of positives coming out from that, right? It will transform this country, right? You're going to see things like Bitcoin being set up, right? So there are so many antecedents that are going to go through this transformation cycle. And by the time we come out, they will be established forms, if that makes sense. It will be kind of what we'll see. I'll give you a perfect example for that. In the late 90s, early 2000s, they were talking about it was a dot-com bubble, right? Like, oh, you can do this with this, right? They're trying to get the internet up off the ground, right? And some of the things that we take for granted now, they actually were talking about back then. Like, you could go online and you can get food delivered to you. You can, like, all this other stuff, like, and then all that crashed and burned, right? It was like, because there wasn't the full acceptance by the people because there just wasn't the infrastructure, blah, blah, right? All these things weren't there, but the seeds were planted, right? Now, 20 some odd years later, almost 30 years later, we live in this world where Uber Eats, right? Amazon. This is the same thing that you're going to see with things like Bitcoin, right? The sustainability movement, right? Going through the trial of fire of Uranus in Gemini is going to create the structure from which we will be able to implement those things. Is that if that's making sense? Because it's going to
Yeah.
be out with the old, in with the new, right? And that comes with breaking a few eggs, right? And so that's a lot what's happened. So I don't hold it to be like, oh, there's not going to be any difficult. There will be difficult, right? Um, one of the things that I've looked at and considered, it's almost there are elements from each of the preceding cycles, right? It's not going to be civil war in this country here, but we are obviously very polarized, right? But so it's not going to be, when I mean conflict, I don't mean the conflict on our soil per se, right? I mean us fighting a global conflict outside the states. But there will be some fraction in this country. One of the more crazier thoughts I've considered, because I see that's potential, you may see, this us becoming more of a confederation of states, if you will. I mean, that's one of my crazier ones. I'm like, and you see that movement not just in Texas, right? Because you've heard about Texas, we're the free state of Texas, and they've always been threatening to leave, right? That's what Texas is about. But in Oregon, and Idaho, right? So I wouldn't be surprised if there's going to be serious movements for that to occur during the 7 year cycle, right? So those are kind of the crazier, extreme ones that I've considered. But at the very least, there will be some type of major conflict that will then be the catalyst by which we then implement Bitcoin or cryptocurrency in a way that's, to be honest with you, I know I'm concerned about the whole CDC and credit, not credit, uh, what do they call those things? Cryptocurrency controlled by the central government, things like that. I feel that they will probably try to implement some of those controls, but I think they're going to be undone by their own cleverness. I don't know if I can say that more clearly like that, but the astrology points to them feeling that they can have control and they don't have control. And what they try to do collapses under their own weight of them trying to implement it. Right. And I see that as part of when I've looked at the astrology of it. That's what I've concluded for myself. So these next 6 years, right? And we're not that far from it, right? I think 2026 there's something pretty significant happening in 2026 that could be connected with some kind of economic crisis. I don't feel it's going to be like, Great Depression type stuff and whatnot, but there will be kind of like, an economic difficulty here in the States that goes for 2.5 years or so. Then we get into 28, 29, and the way that we've kind of gotten out of wars in this country is out of economic crisis, we go to war.
Mm.
So this is where I see about 29, 30, where the conflict comes. Who is it with? I don't know, right? People always like say, oh, it's going to be with China. I think you're seeing it develop between the conventional West, right? Europe, America, those allies, NATO and whatnot, and then you see the other side, Russia, Iran, you know, all that, right? So you kind of see that really being set up, if you will. And so will Israel be a flashpoint? Will Middle East be a flashpoint? Like it's hard to know, right? That's where we're not sure, but it's those two camps, and that's the best that I feel like I can come up with. But there will be some type of conflict, and I think that what is important for us to do is these things that we're about, right? Especially like your age group, right? Because this will be the formative experience for you that you'll be talking about 30 years from now, right? And so you're going to be kind of ushering this age, right? And so your initiation to have access to this world is this event or the series of event. Is that making sense? Right?
Yeah.
So that's how these things go, right? You get initiated, right? It doesn't just like, oh, here you go. All right. World does not work that way. You have to earn that, right? And you earn it by going through these things because it matures you. The reason, I'm gonna say it like this is the reason that you're the person that you are, where you have this level of awareness, is because that's what you're here to strengthen. You see, you have these tools, and now you're going to get to use them, right? And that becomes the defining moment for you, right? My defining moment was, well, a couple of them, but like 9/11, right? That for me was like, whoa, what's going on here, right? That whole thing in the first Gulf War, you know, even before that in high school and such. But I think this one is going to be big for everybody because it transforms this nation, right? I have no doubt that there'll still be a United States, right? But it's going to be transformed into from what it is, and so it's going to be hard for those who are the very stereotypical America first, blah blah blah, like this kind of energy, right?
Mm.
Because it's going to be changed, right? And those who can adapt to the fact that it's very different are going to be the one that will be moving forward, if you will, because the contrast for them will be so sharply their psyche may not be able to handle it. You
Mm.
kind of see what I'm saying, and that's
Yeah.
what I see. Whereas the younger generation, your generation, right, it's like, okay, this is what you've been wanting, but to get there you go through this thing, right? And so someone like myself can be like, oh, okay, here's how we might do it, that, right? So I think there's this intergenerational thing that needs to happen to where we can be of help to each other, and that's what I feel is kind of the cool part, because a lot of what you're doing and about is things that I imagine that we could get to that, right? It's like, oh, we're finally here, right? So my life thrust has almost been like, oh, I'm seeing it unfold in front of me, right? With what you're about and the ethos that you're bringing to the table. Do you see what I'm saying? You're like the promise of kind of what we were thinking about back then, right? And now it's like, oh, so our story continues to unfold. You kind of see what I'm saying? That
Yeah.
makes sense? Yeah. So that's so yes, transforming. Yes, there's going to be some craziness ahead. There are really good books out. There's a couple good books out there that speak to it, but yeah, so I'm just saying right now, I think it's going to be 29, 30 is when you can expect the actual conflict, right?
Okay.
So that's I've seen it from too many different directions and things like that. So there
Yeah.
we go.
You heard
That's
it
what
here, folks.
you
You
heard
heard
it
it
here
here
first, right?
first.
So hopefully that wasn't too long-winded and that was kind of clear enough.
Oh, that was amazing. Thank you. Thank you. I'm so glad that I have it. Something I do often is I re-listen to my podcasts because there's just so much valuable information that I think it takes a couple of rounds for it to really, because like, yeah, the podcast is for other people, but it's really for me. Um, so
Sure,
I'm,
sure.
I'm
I love it.
yeah. Grateful. Well, I mean, we don't have time for the closing questions, but I just want to say thank you so, so much for this, for your time, just your your knowledge, your wisdom. This is so fucking valuable, and I'm really grateful.
Thank you for that. Thank you for having me on. I kind of see what you're doing, and it inspires me. So,
Mm,
thank you. It really is a beautiful thing I'm seeing here. Thank you.
yay. And so how can people find you and work with you?
Sure, sure. Deep dive with drsteve.com. Just as
Great
this
name.
sounds, all lowercase, deep dive with Dr.
Okay.
Steve.com.
I'll include all of this information in the show notes as well.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that's they can find me for my astrology, of course, and then I do both. So I do the medical aspects as well. But to be honest with you, it's really the astrology that's taken off that I'm really excited to share with people. So that's how they can get a hold of it.
Awesome. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. I know I did. There are so many pearls here. So if you gained anything from this podcast and would like to support it, please leave your rating, review, and share with a friend. And of course, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss an episode. Again, you can find all of Dr. Steve's information in the show notes, and you can find my information in the show notes as well.